Okay, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. I hope everyone is well, and friends that are joining us today. We have with us today, mashallah, Dr. Carl Sharif, who is a doctor, professor who specializes in Islamic studies in the Arabic language, mashallah. Assalamu alaikum, doctor. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, very good, doctor. Jazakallah khair for joining us today. We're going to be covering a really interesting topic, mashallah, one that you have spent a lot of time looking into and developing resources on, mashallah, as we've got the your course on the Sapiens Institute website, which we'll be referring to later on, and you can give us a bit of an introduction to that as well, inshallah. But today we're talking about the LGBT topic and in relation to Islam. And I think it's a very important topic. It's an essential topic, especially for Muslims living in the West and anywhere, to be honest, in the world today. And it's a topic, it's a hot topic. Most people don't want to touch it. Those that do don't know how to deal with it or how to address it. So I think this is a very important live. It's going to be a summarized version of obviously your work, mashallah, which we will provide people with resources too, inshallah, so they can go and study this further. But without further ado, doctor, let's get into it, inshallah. The very first thing I guess I want to start with, and one of the parts of your course that I really enjoyed, because it's something I've been looking into myself, which is the history and the sort of backdrop to this whole LGBT subject in and of itself. So if you can give us an introduction to it, where it all started, how did we get here today, essentially?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Ashraf al-Anbiya wal Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawm al-din. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for having me today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and all of your viewers. So I think it's very important, whenever we deal with any type of phenomenon, to really take a step back and realize that we live in a very specific moment in time. Everybody does. We live in specific moments in time. And when you're embedded in a moment, it's very difficult to see the contingency of your moment. And what I mean by that is that when you grow up in a particular discourse like we do today in the West surrounding gender and sexuality, in general, and homosexuality more specifically, you get the impression that things have always been the way they're talked about right now. And I always like to point out to people that back in the 1960s, which was not that too far, not that too far back, it was impermissible in the West to even use the word pregnant on public television, like in the soap operas that they used to have in the daytime for women who are at home watching soap operas. They would say, oh, she's expecting, she's with child. Even to say something like pregnant was considered like too forward, and so obviously there's been a radical shift in mores. At the same time, through the late 1960s, it was unheard of in the West for a man and a woman to live together outside of marriage. This was just completely unacceptable. It doesn't mean that zina didn't occur at all. Of course it did, but it was not the normative. It was not the social norm. It's not what people were supposed to be doing. It's not what was taught in schools. And just also in terms of like formalizing that in terms of a man and a woman officially living together, like we have the same address, we go back to the same place at night and we're not married. There was simply no social space for that. It was simply not there. Just like in most of the Muslim world today, or probably all of the Muslim world, you just can't do that. Like, people have zina, but you can't just move in with someone. Like there's just no kind of cultural space for that, so to speak. And so how did we get from there to, where we are today, right? People don't realize that it's such a different ball game that we're dealing with. And the major event that took place in the 1960s is the sexual revolution. And a revolution means that things change radically and that very few things are the same after the revolution than they were before. That's what a revolution means. Things turn completely. And so what you have in the 1960s, along with the civil rights movement in the United States, but then also more generally like second wave feminism across the Western world, part of this was a questioning and rejection of things like gender roles, between men and women, and the idea that those were kind of socially constructed and women should get out into the workforce and basically compete with men, in traditionally male spaces and kind of do the same things as men do in order to reach fulfillment in the same type of manner. So there was a questioning of gender roles. And then that, later on, theorized into, or, transformed into a theorization of the questioning of gender itself. But before that, in the 1960s, you get a rejection of traditional gender norms and also a rejection of traditional sexual morality, i.e. the rules that govern the relationship between the two sexes. As we said before that, Premarital sex was considered wrong by society. Many higher institutions of education were segregated by sex. Harvard University was only for men. People don't realize that until the late 60s. And you had Radcliffe College, which is kind of on the same campus, but that was the women's college. And Harvard was for the men, but they were not educated together. And
This
this
is
is,
in the 60s.
yeah, yeah. In the
Wow. Okay.
up until like the late 60s, most of these places integrated in the 70s, early 70s. I went to a boarding school myself that, Choate Rosemary Hall. Was in one town and Rosemary Hall was like 20 miles away. Rosemary Hall was for the girls and Choate was for the boys. Like they were literally miles away.
Wow.
And they came together in one campus in 1972. But before that, it was just common sense that if you put young men and women together, people know human nature, they know what's going to happen. And the idea is if you take things like, the family seriously, then you cannot afford to allow sexuality just to be unbridled and undirected. Because
Hmm.
basically, one of the main catalysts, I believe, of the sexual revolution in the 1960s, of course, many factors play into it, but probably the main catalyst is the introduction of the birth control pill, which comes out, I believe, in 1959. And I always, like to say before that, right? Before the birth control pill, you didn't really have any foolproof means of contraception. Condoms
Hmm.
existed, but they were not really as effective as they are today. And so the idea is that the sexual act, whatever meaning we might give to it subjectively or culturally, it is, in the end of the day, a reproductive act. Just mechanically speaking, it's a reproductive act, right? And the natural consequence of it, although it doesn't happen every time, the natural
Hmm.
consequence is that you're depositing sperm in a place where a woman's eggs are, and they get fertilized, and the woman gets pregnant. Like that's what the act is all about. And if you live in an environment, which has been the case of humanity until literally 50 years ago, where every act of sexual intercourse almost always carries with it the risk of the natural consequence of the act, which is pregnancy, it's very obvious to anyone with half a brain why no society or ethical system could really afford to have anything other than the quote unquote sort of traditional view on sexuality, which restricts it
Right.
to marriage. You simply cannot have women getting pregnant with random babies left and right where no one knows who the father is, right? This is disaster. Who's going to take care of those children? Who's going to be legally responsible for them? It's going to be the woman. Women didn't work in the past, so she's dependent on her family. Now it's her family's problem. The man can just run out. Like it's a major disaster, and it completely undermines the family, which is the central institution of society, right? So this was just intuitively obvious, I think, to most human beings throughout most of history. When you bring the birth control pill into the picture, you all of a sudden, for the first time, reliably break the natural link between the act and its natural consequences. Because if you take
Hmm.
the pill faithfully and do it correctly, it is like quite foolproof, 99 point whatever percent. Um,
Yeah.
so the idea is that, for the first time, you can, through artificial means, engage in the act without having to worry about the consequences. And once that happens, you start to get a breakdown in the moral structure surrounding sexuality. Because people say, well, if the
Hmm.
consequence can be taken off the table, then why should the old rules, restricting sexuality to marriage, why should we adhere to those anymore? Right. And
Right, got you. So,
yeah,
doctor, just a question on that. So that's we're talking like 1959, 1960s, where the birth control pill comes
yeah.
into play. Prior to that, and as based on your work, obviously we don't want to go into too much detail here, but I would like you to touch upon some of the earlier years or the earlier centuries. So the foundations were laid even prior to the birth control pill coming into effect. The turning away from religion, turning away from God,
Hmm.
becoming more materialistic and secular, etc. So give us
Right.
some information on that as well. I think that's quite relevant too.
So that's important too. I mean, obviously, we live in the modern period in the West. The modern period is very much defined as a secular age. It's very self consciously secular. And to be secular, especially when you're coming out of a Christian past, is to self consciously turn against religion. So the modern world, although there are religious people in it, the modern world itself is very kind of, again, by design and self consciously and proudly anti-religious, or at least non-religious. But I would say, like, again, coming out of that background, you have to be anti-religious in order to sort of bring things, to a secular kind of
Yeah.
middle. Um, and so, for many reasons that we can't go into now, although I do in the course in much greater detail, you do have an attenuating of the authority of revelation, the authority of religion in the church, and so on and so forth. So there is a gradual secularization that takes place, primarily starting, I would say, in the 18th century with the Enlightenment, and then trickling down to the man in the street in the 19th century. There's a well-known book called the secularization of the European mind in the 19th century. So that's really the century during which kind of the everyday European person became much more secularized. Despite that, if you look at church attendance statistics in England and France, like these central European countries, even in the early 20th century, you still have large portions of the population still going to church. So the shakliyat, like the kind of outward forms were still maintained for quite some time. And of course, in the 1950s, at least in the United States, there was sort of, a lot of stress was put socially on church attendance and all of that. Some people say it might have been very superficial. But what I would say is that because you had the gradual weakening of religion over the centuries, and religious authority was kind of reduced from one domain after another. First, science, talking about the natural world was given over to science, and whatever the Bible had to say about that was considered just, metaphorical. People would say, well, okay, religion is about morals. It's not about like the universe. That's what science is for, but at least it's about morals. But, one domain gets chipped off after another, one after the other. And I think when we get to the 1960s, you really have a kind of deep-seated secularism in society that has basically eviscerated much of the actual moral conviction behind particularly the sexual morality that was in place at the time, which was very much in conformity with Christian sexual norms. Okay, so I think what happened is once, I think it was like a shell, like a facade with nothing behind. Like when you go to Disney World,
Yep.
you take the tour around, you see all those castles, and then you go
Yep.
behind, and there's nothing behind it. It's just like a wajiha, like a facade.
Yep. Yep.
I think the moral structure, at least when pertaining to sexuality, had basically become like that by the 60s. It was basically a shell. The only reason it hadn't crumbled yet is because people were probably still afraid of, pregnancy. Like there are just
Yes.
practical reasons that we can't just dive in. Although there have been calls before for like a radical sexual liberation, even in the 1930s by some German thinkers, for example. But it seems like the society, it only kind of took up that call and let the facade fall once, the sort of pragmatic fear was taken away through the birth control pill, and then the whole structure just collapsed within a decade. Now, contrast this, for example, with other parts of the world, like the Muslim world, China. The birth control pill, once it's available, it's available. You can't confine technology. And so although these technologies also became available elsewhere, they did not result. We've not seen a sexual revolution until today in the Muslim world. Right? Or again, in a place like China or other regions, India. And so I think if you just take the case of the Muslim world, I think the, religion is still strong enough and normative enough, and people kind of put enough value in it that even if you now have technically the means to sort of separate, again, the sexual act from its natural consequences, that doesn't automatically lead to a collapse in the moral structure of society, the sexual morality in the society, because it's being propped up by actual conviction. Do you know what I'm saying? Which is built into a larger, commitment of Muslims by and large to their religion, to the truth of their religion. Even if, we all fall short as individuals and as societies, but still, Islam retains a normative place in the Muslim world and among Muslims that, Christianity has not enjoyed in the West for a good long time.
Yes, yeah,
So
absolutely. And that's a very important point, Jazakallah, Dr. for highlight. And it's interesting because when you go back to the sort of 18th century and so on, and you look at the Enlightenment, you realize that all of the crises that we see today, the crisis of morality, the crisis of meaning, identity, which we're discussing specifically today, it all originates from when human beings literally turned away from the belief in God and a higher purpose, and then replaced it with a new vision or a new purpose, which was, you can thank the existentialist philosophers a lot for introducing these new sort of replacement patches, if you like, to the emptiness that was there within human beings once they turned away from God. But it was essentially a nihilism where existentialist philosophers came in and they were like, okay, let's fill this, and then they started to create their own theories and ideas about how to create meaning. And you see, it's almost like man is replaced with God over these centuries, and man
God is replaced by
becomes the
man.
ultimate,
Yeah.
becomes the ultimate
Exactly.
authority. He
Right.
decides what's right, he decides what's wrong, he decides the direction of his life, what meaning is, etc. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can see how this eventually gets to the point where the the potential fear that was there of becoming pregnant, etc., and how that would affect society, when that was removed through the pill in the 60s, they were ready. People were ready to go this way, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Again, the moral conviction, I think, had basically been hollowed out, and was just hanging on by a
Yeah.
thread, maybe by some of the older generations, but the younger generation, was ready to kind of overturn it. And then it became pragmatically possible to do that once you had the means to kind of separate. Now, this is only theoretical, by the way, because, apparently, like if you look at statistics, the number of illegitimate pregnancies and births skyrocketed after the sexual revolution, although the pill was
Interesting.
available, which means that people were not necessarily using it or using it properly.
Mm,
But it became a sexual free for all. But it's not like everyone was actually availing themselves of this new technology in the proper way, or the way that it was intended to be used. And so you actually have a kind of a skyrocketing of out of wedlock births after the sexual revolution, which you would think, okay, if before the sexual revolution you had X number of out of wedlock pregnancies, now you have the pill, you would expect that to go to zero or close to zero.
yeah.
But it doesn't.
Yeah.
It actually increases. And that just shows you that people's behavior actually matters. So
Mm,
before birth control, you had social and personal norms and controls in place that meant that people were actually like more careful with their behavior, because they just, again, those consequences were very heavy, and heavier on the
mm,
woman, of course, too, because a woman is the one who gets pregnant. And again, a man can disappear, a woman cannot. She cannot
yes.
disappear. Um,
Mm.
so
Makes sense, Doctor. And that it's very interesting. So it's almost like what you're saying is that the introduction of the pill almost happened at the perfect time, where society had morally degraded to a certain level, and they were almost ready to take that leap. And then some people, yeah, the pill, okay, got the revolution
yeah,
started, but
you
there were,
blow on it and it collapses. Yeah,
yeah, and there were some people that didn't use like this safety, and it shows that people just rode the wave. They were ready to ride the wave,
exactly. Yeah, yeah, because it
and
became a
that's what happened.
cultural wave and a new norm and so
Hmm.
forth. And so whether or not you were actually using the pill, it became a sexual, like this is what the late 60s and early 70s was known for. And there was
Hmm.
also there were protests against, of course, the Vietnam War and things like that. So they say make love, not war. Okay, don't
Yeah,
make war. That's good. It doesn't mean you just have illegitimate sexual intercourse, right?
yeah, yeah. So
So
so let's go from I guess this is a nice segue now. So from the 60s
mhm,
to 2024, where we are today. Give us
okay.
some information between of these decades.
So an important result of the sexual revolution, which I think is very important now for LGBT specifically, is if you live in a world where, again, the sexual act is seen as being naturally and necessarily connected to the act of reproduction, right? Then it makes
Mm,
sense for you that the act is also a naturally heterosexual one, because you see sexuality as having some type of objective function and purpose. Okay, objective
mm,
function
yeah.
and purpose, which ultimately, again, we can add meanings to it. It's about commitment, it's about love, it's about this and that. That's fine, right? But ultimately it has an objective purpose, which is ultimately creation and the founding of families. Okay, so in that's the older paradigm, right?
Yeah.
Under that paradigm, something like homosexual behavior doesn't really make much moral sense, right? Because it,
Mhm.
it would very naturally be seen by people living under such a paradigm as an aberration of the normal teleology of sexuality, meaning the purpose of it, and a violation of that purpose. And again, most people believe that that's okay, God created it with a purpose and so forth. And if you didn't, okay, nature, but the idea was that it had some type of natural function. And if the natural function is ultimately reproductive, then clearly sexuality is also, can only really be heterosexual, to fulfill that natural function of it to be respected. And so something like same-sex sexual relations would have just, they existed. Of course, they were very taboo. They're forbidden by Christianity as by Islam, right? And they're also illegal in most countries around the world, including the West and the United States. But I'm just saying again, in people's mind, it was intuitive to them why something like same-sex behavior would be immoral, despite the
Yeah.
fact that it doesn't carry the very grave consequences of male-female zina, right? Two women
Mhm.
can't produce a baby, two men can't produce a baby. Although with males, particularly if you're talking about intercourse, there are very real health, risks involved. So putting that aside, just the very idea, right? And I grew up at a time. I'm not that old, but I grew up at a time, 1980s, where it was still very much the norm among the common person in the street in the West that, yeah, of course, homosexual behavior is wrong. The question could be asked, what do you think about homosexuality? Okay, LGBT,
Mhm.
that term didn't even exist, I think, until the earlier mid 90s. So in the 80s, we said homosexuality. And people, you could ask the question, what do you think about homosexuality? And it was understood that you were asking, what is your position on a particular moral action? What is your moral position on a particular action among people? And the majority of people would have said, oh, it's wrong. Okay. What happens after the sexual revolution, once you break that bond between sex and reproduction, and therefore marriage and religious morality, and so on and so forth, all of those things now fly off in their own direction. Sex becomes one thing, reproduction another thing, marriage, you can either marry or not. Religious morality is being thrown out the window, at least when it comes to sexuality. So all of those things fly off in their own separate direction. So now you have sex as its own thing. And now it's no longer seen as having an inherent purpose or function. The body parts associated with it are also no longer seen as having an inherent function or purpose, which it would be morally right to use them in accord with, and morally wrong to use them, out of accord and not in accord with, right? That all goes by the wayside. And so sexuality now, it can take on all these different meanings. It doesn't have to be related anymore to reproduction, marriage, and therefore, if it doesn't have to be related necessarily to reproduction and marriage, why should it be arbitrarily limited to just males and females? Now that starts to look arbitrary, because sex can get redefined now. It can be primarily about love. It can be primarily about commitment. It can be primarily about companionship. It can be primarily about one-night stands. It can be primarily about pleasure. It can be primarily about my identity and kind of who I am and what I'm all about in the world, right? It can be many of these other things. And once that's what sexuality, is all about, or is seen as being all about, all of a sudden now it starts to look arbitrary to say, well, it should just be restricted to males and females. That starts to look like an irrational prejudice, right? Because you've taken away all of the presuppositions in light of which the natural heterosexual, or the heterosexuality of sex, appears to be natural and normal and the morally kind of right thing. Do you see what I'm saying? So in that context, now you can start to have the gay rights movement emerge, which it starts in the late 1969, actually, in the month of June, which is why they've chosen June as Pride Month, in a inn in New York City called the Stonewall Inn, which was like a gay bar. And back then, men would gather, like congregate in these bars, and they would drink and then like dance. I mean, as far as I know, they were not actually having like sex, but they were just like dancing. And even that was considered illegal, and the police would raid these bars and arrest them and so forth.
Wow.
And on one such occasion, the police raided, and the patrons of this bar said, "That's it. We've had enough. We're fighting back." And they actually fought back the police and said, "You can't do this. Like, we have the freedom to just, live our lives as we want. You can't arrest us. This can't be illegal." And this kind of gets the modern gay rights movement as we know it today. The LGBT movement started. Of course, again, LGBT was not a term back then, but it was called the gay rights movement. And that kicks off in June 1969. But it dovetails with the sexual revolution. And this is also the height of the sexual revolution, right? And so it also is playing into, or, this atmosphere in which all of the norms regarding sex and sexuality have been overturned and put on the table and thrown into question, and the authority of the church has been separated from them. A marriage has been, again, once you start shacking up, as we used to call it, and it becomes acceptable for men and women to live together outside of marriage, well, now marriage is not even required for sex either. So why can't two people of the same sex? Of course, there was no such concept of gay marriage back then, but now marriage is not required for sex anyway. So,
Sure.
Go ahead. If,
pretty much anything
a
goes
guy and a
pretty much
girl
at
on a
this
campus can get together, why not two guys or two women? Again, it was still very odd back then socially, but the point is that the seeds were in place now, right? Once you start drawing some of these things to their logical, taking them to their logical conclusion, you say, well, if we've accepted this, then why stop here? If we do this, why not that?
Yeah.
And, you more and more you get this argument that, okay, it's just kind of arbitrary now to restrict. And so this is, so throughout the 70s and 80s, culturally speaking, you get a normalization of things like zina, basically fornication. You get a normalization of males and females living together outside of marriage. It's in every movie of the 80s and television series. It's completely normalized. And also you have now a budding gay rights movement, which also seeks to normalize homosexual relationships, and to show to the public and to convince the public that there is no essential difference between heterosexual and homosexual relationships, and that they should be accepted on a par with each other. Another thing that happens, so just conceptually speaking, I think this is one of the elements that make this such a difficult or thorny issue for religious people of traditional religious, commitment, is that, I mentioned before that there were like 4 things that were tightly bound together before the sexual revolution, right? And these are things
Mhm.
which are bound together by nature, we would say. I mean, and by God's command, Allah's decree and
Yep.
command. So when we say nature, we don't mean, as separate from Allah, but naturally so, and by the divine command, both Allah's creative command and his legislative command, his moral command. And this is sex, marriage, or like a, legally, legal contract between a man and a woman, um, uh, sex, marriage, uh, reproduction, right? Again,
Mhm.
reproduction meaning natural outcome of sex, and morality, particularly religiously defined morality. Okay, so these things were very tightly bound in people's minds, including in the West, until the 1960s. As we said, the sexual revolution comes and kind of splits the atom, and those go off in their 4 separate directions. Meanwhile, and this is also part of a longer process which starts earlier, in the late 19th century, we would say, you have 3 other elements which used to be and should be by nature also, and by Allah's legislative decree, 3 separate things. Those get mashed together. And those 3 things are desire, particularly
Mhm.
sexual desire, and more specifically homosexual desire, actions, okay? And then, so the idea is that if I have a desire, I should be able to act on it, particularly a sexual desire. Okay.
Right.
This, before the sexual revolution, people would have said, no, you have a desire, but there are rules that govern sexuality, and it can be tough and challenging. Sexuality is a very powerful force, but just because you have a desire doesn't mean that you have the moral right to act on it. That was not taken for granted. That comes to be
Mhm.
taken for granted after the sexual revolution, when Christian moral norms are thrown out the window regarding sexuality. So if I have a desire, my action just flows naturally from it, and is also morally legitimated by the desire itself, as long as the person I'm engaging with is, consents. Consent becomes the only criterion. So you have desires
Mhm.
and actions now become almost fused together. Okay. And then very, very importantly, those are taken, especially in the case of homosexual desires, those are taken now as the basis of an identity. They become part of a person's sense of identity.
Mm.
Okay. Not just what I feel or even what I do, but who I am. Okay.
Right.
So there have been people in the past who have had homosexual inclinations and who had
Yep.
homosexual behavior. And this has been throughout history. And we see it also in Muslim history and in literature. We talk about that in the course. We see it in the West. People conceived of this differently. But, whether it was considered acceptable or unacceptable, sinful, a big deal, not a big deal, whatever, and cultures have varied widely on the specifics of the ways in which they've dealt with homosexual desires and manifestations of it in action. Okay, but that is definitely not something that's new. It's been around for a very long time, but
Yep.
almost never, I mean, I think we can say never before the late 19th, early 20th century in the West was this ever taken to be some like the basis of a personal identity. And it's very
Mm.
hard for us people today who grew up, especially in the West, to think of it as anything but, right? Because that's what the discourse is. The idea that someone might feel attracted towards members of their same sex, either exclusively or predominantly, or maybe they're bisexual, what we'd say today bisexual, right? Maybe they feel that but don't act on it. Maybe they act on it and they actually have relations with members of their own sex, but they still don't identify as being a particular subclass of human beings based on that
Mm.
desire. Just like another, I mean, you could think of another desire, even another sexual desire or practice that people may or may not engage in, but that's just it. It's something you do or don't do, something you desire or don't desire.
Yep.
It's not a question of who you are. And
Why do you think, Doctor? Why do you think that is the case? Why have the proponents of the LGBT movement? Why is it so important for them to represent themselves as this, take it as an identity? Do you have any thoughts on this? Like, why is it so important for them to see it as an identity and then
yeah,
to promote it as an identity?
so I'm not sure it's really like their fault, so to speak. I don't think that it's not the contemporary LGBT movement that, like, in the last 3 decades made this up. This goes
Mhm.
back, I mean, you could obviously, there are different ways you could analyze the data. What seems to be the case from my studies is that, well, in the 19th century, you have a medicalization of society. Part of the modernization, kind of rationalization of society. The natural sciences are progressing, and medicine is also becoming more sophisticated and also more regimented, and people want to find like a scientific and medical reason for everything. And so people in like the mid 19th century, this phenomenon of homosexual behavior, which before that was just considered like a sin, like this is just like qawm lut,
Yeah.
sodomy was a crime. It's just people doing vicious acts, like people steal, people murder, people drink, people fornicate, people sodomize, like it was just kind of a bad action that people were doing, and it was seen as a sin, and that was kind of the beginning and the end of it. Like there wasn't really much more theorization about it other than, okay, this is just a wrong action based on religious morality, and it's just part of the fallen world, and to put it in Christian terms. In the mid 19th century, people kind of look at it and say, wait a minute, what's actually going on here? Why is it that certain men seem to be drawn towards sexual behavior with other men or women? So they started to conceive of it as, okay, this is something now that is open for our empirical study as kind of a neutral phenomenon, right? It's something we observe in the world. There are men, not all men do this, but some men, not all women do it, but some women. What is it that's it starts to be seen as like a particular class of persons. Now, this was not originally in order to promote and to validate. In fact, it was kind of the opposite. Homosexuality was medicalized and psychologized, and in a sense, in becoming so, it was also stigmatized. It came to be seen as a disorder, right? Classified as a disorder. Before it was like a moral disorder or a moral failure, maybe not a disorder. We don't really talk about moral disorders, but it was a immoral action. Now it starts to come to be seen as some type of disorder, right? Because it's a deviation from the norm. And so the idea is that it becomes medicalized, theorized, bracketed off as a specific, type of person now who is engaging in a particular type of activity. But that particular class of persons is now, in a sense, stigmatized, because the idea is that you have a disorder or there's something wrong, and we're trying to figure out what's wrong with you and see if we can fix it, right? So I think it is through doing that, right, that it was in the late, I believe 1869, that the term homosexuality was first coined. Before that, there wasn't even a term for it, right? There were just terms for the specific actions, like sodomy was male-male intercourse, right? But there was not a term for homosexuality, meaning an umbrella term that grouped together all sorts of phenomena, from desires to any kind of action of a sexual nature between two members of the same sex. Those were not conceptually seen as belonging in one like distinctly defined category. So it gets categorized, right? And I think it's through that categorization that people are now treated by the medical establishment, the scientific establishment, as constituting a specific class, right? And then through that, you start to get, a trickle-down effect where the category sort of starts to propagate among the population. And now if you have people who are homosexual, well, what's the obverse of that? Well, everyone else then is heterosexual. But even heterosexual, the conceptualization of it is kind of a new concept. So if you were to ask someone maybe in the year 1900 in New York or London on the street, are you gay or straight? They would have said, what are you talking about? Well, first of all, gay just meant happy back then. Like, that was the normal original meaning of the word. And to say, are you straight? Like, these terms were not available. And to say, are you heterosexual or homosexual? Like, they just wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Like, you would have had to explain, oh, do you like to sleep with people of your same sex? Oh, no. Oh, okay, you're the, but, I'm not saying the phenomenon there weren't people who were more like this or more like that. I'm not saying that wasn't, but conceptualizing this as part of one's core identity. That's what I'm saying. This is very different. So the idea of a sexual identity, not just a homosexual, the idea of a sexual identity itself is a modern construct. It's contingent on modern it's a modern Western cultural construct and intellectual construct. It's not a natural category. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
But it's one that's almost universal in Western society. If you're not gay, you're straight, and you think of yourself as being like a straight person, you identify as a heterosexual, like most people do, because that's kind of how you're taught. But we shouldn't take that for granted, that you do that. It's like race. Race, it's often pointed out, it is a social construct. And that's true. And the color is not. I mean, color is objective. You can look at people's skin tones. You have very light, very dark, and everything in between. And Allah says this is one of His, signs. From Allah's signs is the ikhtilafu alsinatikum wa alwanikum, the difference in your tongues and in your hues, your colors, right? He doesn't say races. He says your colors. because the idea
Hmm.
of race as a socially significant category, this is definitely a social construct, because there are places in the world where people don't really see race. You could be light skinned, dark skinned, and it just doesn't matter. Doesn't matter socially speaking. Like it's like some people have brown hair, black hair, sandy blonde, blonde. Like it doesn't matter. You can have a preference, but it's not a socially significant category,
Yep.
right? So anyway, I'm just saying, so whether race is just color, or it's race in the way we know it, particularly in the West and particularly in the United States, right, with our very specific history of transatlantic, the transatlantic slave trade and so forth,
Yep.
and subsequent racial problems which continue today, right? Whether that's the case, or whether color is just, again, skin color is no different than hair color or eye color. That's very much, like that's socially contingent, socially and historically contingent, right? Although the color itself is real. And so similarly, I mean, sexual desires are real. I mean, some say that, of course, they are affected by they're constructed in different ways, but they exist. Also, the behaviors have existed, but construing them as a personal identity, or society construing you as being part of a specified class because of certain desires and or actions. This is something that is specific to our current moment, particularly in the West, and it's not shared by other societies even today. Although with the continued propagation of Western society as the normative paradigm throughout the world through
Yep.
technology and so forth, this paradigm is becoming adopted more and more widely, all over the
Sure.
world now. But until
Yep.
very recently, and it's not the case, and in many places in the Muslim world and outside of it, there are still people for whom this is not the case.
Sure.
I think one last thing, and then I'll stop because I've been going on for a while, is that if you look at the four things I said were, should be together, which is sexuality,
Yep.
reproduction, as its natural consequence, even if it doesn't have to result from every act. And in
Hmm.
Islam, married couple can use birth control. Like there's, but the point is, like, that's only a temporary thing, but the natural end is there. So
Sure.
sexuality, reproduction, marriage, and morality, those are,
Yep.
like, again, sent their separate directions. You have now desires, actions, and identity. Those are all like bundled together and seen as
Hmm.
being like co-implicative, like mutalazima. Each one implies the other, and they cannot be separated. And for most modern people in the modern West, particularly, they cannot separate that in their mind. Like that's just presented to them as one undifferentiated thing. Okay. Now,
Hmm.
what's the problem when you adhere to a traditional morality on sexuality, whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or something else, and you say, no, my religion, if you tell someone, okay, I don't believe in zina, like premarital sex between men and women, people might chuckle, laugh, like, oh, that's very old fashioned, or what planet do you come from? Haha. But they're not going to have a visceral reaction against you. They're going to say, okay, you're kind of weird. Okay. But once you say, well, my religion doesn't allow for homosexual behavior, just like it doesn't allow for like heterosexual zina, it doesn't allow for homosexual behavior. All of a sudden, you get this visceral reaction. What? You're a
Hmm.
bigot. You're hateful. You're purveying violence. Like all of this, you get a very, very different reaction, and people see you as having said something completely different. Why? What explains this? What explains it is precisely when you talk about zina, you're talking about an action that people can do or not do. That's it. You're just criticizing someone's action. It's like saying we don't believe in drinking, and people drink.
Yep.
Okay, well, fine. You're criticizing their action. You're not criticizing who they are. But when you say we don't accept homosexual activity or relationships, right? That's no longer viewed by people as, oh, well, that's just another sexual activity among others, just one among
Hmm.
others. It's seen as being core to who people actually are. Now, so if you just say, like, again, these three things are together, um, desires, actions, and identity, those are now together. So when the Muslim comes and says, well, wait a minute, I'm just basically like rejecting the action or saying the action is haram, right?
Yeah.
Again, if it's mutalazima, if it's like co-implicative with the others, well, you can't attack A without attacking B and C, right?
Yeah. You're attacking the whole thing. Yep.
It's
Yep.
like NATO, right? So you
Yeah.
attack one, you attack all of them. So if you say
Subhanallah.
I'm attacking your action, you're attacking my
Identity,
desires
my
and my
desires. Yep.
very identity, which is the most
Yeah.
serious thing, who I am as a person, who I see myself as in the world, what I'm all about, how I present myself to myself and to others. Now, so you're hitting a person where hurts the most, so to speak. Okay, that moral judgment that, okay, your action is haram or, immoral or whatever, unacceptable, forbidden. Now, on the other side, for the person in this paradigm, your moral judgment is what? It's arbitrary, right? It's arbitrary because they no longer have the intuitions which underlie, that moral stance. They no longer believe that sex has any natural inherent function. They no longer believe that it is necessarily, like teleologically tied to reproduction and therefore to marriage. They no longer believe that religion has any, say over our affairs, particularly our sexual behavior. So you are coming with with an arbitrary moral norm, which has no rational or other basis in their view. And that irrational, arbitrary moral norm is being wielded against someone in undercutting their very identity. So it's the perfect storm, and that's why there's such a, kind of clash and an irreconcilable clash between, the traditional kind of religious paradigm of sexuality, right? Gender, sexuality, sexual behavior, all of that is one cluster, and the modern paradigm, which has shattered all of that in completely refashioned sexuality as something else. And of course, there's been now a lot of critique of like gender, even now, not just gender roles, but gender itself, right? We're told that gender is psychological and subjective, right, rather than objective. This is transgender, a completely different story. Like it's related to homosexuality, but it's actually very different at the same time. So anyway, I'll stop there.
This is very interesting, Doctor. We're going to move on to the next section in a second. But for everyone that's joining, brothers and sisters, Dr. Sharif has an extensive course on this on the Sapiens Institute website, which is in the description of this live. So definitely go and go through that course if you're interested. And I would encourage everyone to go through this course because it's so relevant, this particular topic. And also, so it's very interesting and fascinating because one of the things I was thinking about, and I would like to get your comments on this, is how they've deconstructed and reconstructed some of these concepts and ideas in the modern West. All of this activity is not fundamentally grounded in anything objective. It's just based on subjective views and takes of individuals, philosophers, thinkers, etc. Whereas the traditional view, you can say generally and specifically from an Islamic perspective, which we're going to move on to next, everything we believe in, every sort of rules, all the rules and laws we believe are grounded objectively in a higher power. So they're objectively grounded in something. So, I mean, that's something interesting for people to think about as well, especially those that, think that their way today is the right way. The way they have it and the way they understand it is the correct way. Well, what is it all based on? If they really go down that rabbit hole, they'll see, well, it's not based in anything objective. And it's not grounded in any substantial way. Whereas the religious take, or the traditional take, if you like, or the Islamic take, it's grounded in the belief in a higher power, the creator that knows all, the one that's all powerful, etc. So hence we can claim our perspective to be objective. And we'll go into the Islamic paradigm now, but just would like to get your thoughts on that specific point.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I completely agree. And I think that, the fact that it's based in reality and in a higher power, because reality is created by that higher power, which is God, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that allows also for a stability of the moral paradigm, because it's grounded in something that's actually transcendent. When you get rid of that transcendent reference point, and you also get rid of the idea, so the Enlightenment, it gets rid of the transcendent reference point by throwing essentially religious authority out the window in trying to ground all of human knowledge on reason and empirical science, okay? All of human knowledge, including moral knowledge. And it turned out to be very difficult to do that because you can't really, ground moral knowledge, particularly on just reason and science. I mean, they've tried, but it's basically fallen apart. The project has not been able to produce the fruits that were hoped and expected of it, very optimistically in the 18th century. So modernity, classical modernity based on the Enlightenment paradigm, throws out the transcendental reference point, but it still believes in kind of natural, nature as having some type of normative. But then when you move into the postmodern period, which is, what we're in now, postmodernism and modernity and postmodernity, they coexist, but now we're also in the postmodern period. Postmodernity critiques very, astutely. It critiques certain um, presumptions of modernity to
Mhm.
ultimate truth and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it doesn't really replace it with some, it's a deconstructive
Yeah.
project. So it
Yes.
it kind of pokes holes in the pretensions of modernity, but it doesn't go back, say, to the pre-modern and say, okay, we're going to go back to like an actual transcendental paradigm again and reintroduce God and reintroduce a transcendental reference point. It doesn't do that.
Yes.
It just says, well, the Enlightenment essentially tried to replace God with science and human reason, and science and human
Mhm.
reason can't be gods, and we've shown that. So okay, there continues to be no God, and even those pseudo gods are now like have been unmasked, and so everything basically falls into a type of perspectivism, right?
Mhm.
Everything is just my perspective, my kind of subjective experience of the world, and I project it out. And I think obviously, like the transgender movement is sort of one very potent example of that, right? Because even
Yeah.
up until 10 years ago or 5 years ago, if you had a male body but you identified as a female, that was called gender identity disorder, GID. So the idea was like,
Mhm.
again, that was considered disorder. That's not a moral judgment. Like, okay, disorder is not your fault. Like, we'll try to help you. But the idea is that there was something objectively disordered about that, that,
Mhm.
out there in the world, like in the scientific empirical world, right, that the modern paradigm was running on, if you're a male, then you should if you identify as a man, and if you don't, then there's something wrong there. There's that disjuncture is non-normative, right? So
Mhm.
it's a disorder. But now that has been completely, scuttled as well. Like
Sure.
that's no longer the case. They say no, there simply is no necessary connection between biological sex and psychological gender identification.
Mhm.
They happen to line up for the vast majority of people, but that's basically just accidental, although it's statistically very dominant. But there's no
Mhm.
reason why they normatively should. They just happen to, like, as a statistical fact. Okay. But what this means now is that if someone says, well, I have a male body, but I identify as a female, well, okay, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing objectively disordered about that anymore. There's nothing that, okay, there's a problem. Maybe we should try to figure out why this happened. Can we, fix it? Can we ameliorate it? Can we attenuate it? Can we prevent it in the future? Right? All of those are considered bad questions, because the idea is like,
Mhm.
no, biological sex is one thing, psychological gender identity is something else, and there's no reason for them to line up. And so if they don't, well, okay, I have a male body, but I identify as a female. And if there is a disjuncture, which one takes precedence? And they say, again, a choice is made. It's a psychological and a cultural choice, that the psychological takes precedence. So if I
Mhm.
say I'm a woman and I identify as a woman, I am a woman, right? No matter what my body looks like. Even if I don't
Yeah.
go through a transition, or I go through a semi-transition, if I say I'm a woman, I'm a woman. In some places, it's illegal not to confirm that that person actually is a woman, which
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
extraordinary. But
Yeah,
again, it's a
it's
complete,
but
detachment from any
you can
type
see
of, yeah,
why they can get away, why people can do this and justify under their current worldview, if you like.
yeah,
Without God, objectivity goes out the window. The postmodernists now have, if anything, they've followed through fully with,
fully, yeah,
what the modernists did. They turned away from God, but they didn't fully follow through with the
exactly,
implications
yeah,
of that. The
exactly.
postmodernists are like, let's expose where you didn't follow through, and the false promises that you made, and anything goes pretty much. Truth is subjective. Everything becomes subjective. You make what you want of it, and you can see
Well,
why then
truth,
under
they
this
put
type
it
of
in
world.
quotes all the time, right? People say truth,
Yeah,
right? Put it in quotes. And the
yeah,
other thing you say, speak your truth. You keep people say that, speak your truth. In kindness and compassion. Like, what do you mean your truth? Like
yeah,
that doesn't mean anything. Like, truth is something that's objective. It's not personal
yes,
to me. So the very
yeah,
notion of your truth this is kadhib, like this is false. This is a false collocation of terms, but it's very common now, and it shows the underlying, presuppositions. But the other thing too is that we were saying, like, having this transcendental reference point, right,
yes,
where you're anchored, your morality is anchored to the author of the moral law and the author of the the physical universe too. I mean, both of them
yes,
are results of Allah, so they're consistent with each other, and they're grounded in their same eternal transcendental source. And that's why they're also stable across time and place and across societies, right? These norms that we're talking about, Islamic norms, they're the same today as they were yesterday, as they were, at any time. Now, Muslim societies, again, can adhere or fall away, or they can conceive of things and do things different ways, but the actual moral norm of the deen is a stable one, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at, particularly in postmodernism, it's very odd that people, in one respect, they're so relativistic, or at least feign relativism. Oh, anything goes, you do you, your truth, whatever. But when it comes to certain things that they really believe in, like when it comes to like certain gender and LGBT issues, all of a sudden people are very univocal and very dogmatic, and
Yeah.
you wouldn't dare have a different opinion, because they will
And that's
make
a
you
contradiction.
known
Yeah.
what a heretic you are, right? So it is a contradiction. So no one can be a true relativist. It's just it's a mask. People are fooling themselves when they say that. No one is a
Hmm.
true relativist. If I come and kill your brother, you're not going to be like, well, in your moral universe, maybe it's not wrong to kill someone.
Do that. Yeah.
Of course not. Like,
Yeah.
that's ridiculous, right? So when push comes to shove, everybody has some type of moral code that they regard as being, somehow transcending themselves and you, and transcending, the whatever created order, and sort of hovering above, so to speak, right? You
Yeah.
have to, like, you can't conceive of morality any other way. It doesn't make sense to conceive of personal morality. So, because again, I can just come up and steal your car, and just say, well, I don't think stealing is wrong. And you say, no,
Hmm.
it is wrong. But who are you to make an objective moral claim? And again, with
Hmm.
sexuality, it would be, it's inconceivable, that people should be considered to have the right to have like opinions on the morality of sexual behavior. Like, who said that was that's above your pay grade? Who said
Yeah.
that's your right to have an opinion? Well, what do you think of premarital sex? I think it's fine. Well, I think it's a sin. I think people should wait till they're married. What do you think of homosexual behavior? I think it's right or wrong. Who are you to think? It's the same as having, who are you to think whether stealing or murder are right and wrong? Like, most people would still say, no, those are moral standards that don't depend on people's, affirmation of them. They kind of stand on their own. And until the sexual revolution, that's how sexual morality was viewed as well. Like, premarital sex was just wrong. Like, it doesn't matter what you think about it. It's not a question of your opinion. It just is wrong, right?
Yeah.
Again, by nature, by God, whatever, all of these together. But the idea that you could have an opinion on it is absurd, right? And for us
Yeah.
as Muslims, it's absurd too. Like, what do you think about zina? Like, like what? I don't have a personal opinion on it. I can tell you what the hukm of Allah is on it, right? Or
Yeah.
if there's ikhtilaf about something, I can tell you about that. But I don't have a personal opinion on it, especially if it's something that's clear and univocal. But the interesting thing is that people, again, it shows that no one can be a true relativist, right? That these
Yeah.
people who claim relativism are very dogmatic on the things that they really care about. They're only relativistic on things that they don't care about. So all religions are the same. They don't care because they don't believe in any of them, right? So who cares? You're a monotheist, you're a polytheist, you believe Jesus is God, you believe Jesus is not God, it's all the same. Who cares? It's
Hmm.
easy to be a relativist when you don't really care. You don't have stakes in the issue. But turn to
Yeah.
something that they have like skin in the game, and again, you'll have a very different reaction. And the other thing that I think is self-refuting for that paradigm is that, okay, at least if you had a consistent, durable view, maybe we could take it more seriously. But when your view is changing every 5 years,
Yeah.
and just, it's like a kaleidoscope, you keep turning and you get all these phantasmagoric, like,
Different colors. Yeah.
different, like, how's anyone supposed to take that seriously, right? No, gender is completely socially constructed. Really? Like, you didn't think that 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, and now you're so dogmatic about it, and you're going to start arresting people if they don't agree with you. It's like, on what basis do you have such confidence in your judgment, which is so ephemeral, which came out of nowhere? I mean, not out of nowhere, there's theorization and all that, but even that only goes back a couple decades. It comes to a
Yeah.
head in a particular cultural moment, and then you jump on board and you're ready to, it's like the fashion of the day is taken, because again, people long for transcendence, right? This is part of the fitrah, and they take
Yeah.
whatever ephemeral, semi quasi, like, social consensus has been achieved, right? And they absolutize it and they transcendentalize it, right? No, this is a a norm that has to now be implemented throughout the world also. right? We can't
Subhanallah.
have backwards Muslim countries treating, men and women as if these were natural categories, or not having trans rights, or not doing whatever, right? So it's not just in our culture here. It's like, it's so odd to think that people could take themselves seriously. It's like you
Yeah,
yourself didn't believe this 10 years ago, and now
yeah.
you believe it, and now it's the absolute indisputable, like, gospel truth, as they say in English,
Hmm.
right? When religion still mattered, people understood what that meant. We said gospel truth, right? It's like saying kitab wa sunnah,
Yeah.
right? Allah.
But it goes against the very paradigm of
Yeah,
truth,
and
the
you're
concept
going
of
to start implementing it across the world and judge every other society and every other time period based on this standard, and the standard is fickle, and the standard is brittle and has nothing and then it changes 10 years later. You have a completely different view. Do you know?
yeah.
So, I mean, look, people in the late 1960s, pornography was illegal in the Western world. Okay. 1967, they make printed materials allowable. I'm talking about like salacious novels. I mean, imagine a Europe where even like racy novels were forbidden because it was just considered indecent. Those were made 1967, they were made legal. 1969, they legalized everything else, pictures and videos. Okay. In certain countries, I believe Denmark and Holland, either one or both of them, they removed all restrictions on pornographic content and production. And they did not specifically ban child pornography. Okay, which means that in those countries, child pornography flourished throughout the 1970s until they became
Wow.
Northern Europe became a world hub of child porn, because it wasn't illegal. Okay, what is child porn? I mean, it is basically videotaping children being raped and molested, and then marketing it for profit. This is like absolutely the most like disgusting thing or demonic thing you
Yeah.
could ever think of. I mean, how could people have been like, well, we just don't regulate sexuality? Like, it's absurd. And then it was not until like 1977 they're like, wait a minute, maybe we should start passing laws banning like child porn, not adult porn, but child porn. And then the other thing too is that, even the idea that children were not legitimate objects of kind of sexual interest of adults. This is something that's only, the ideas on it. People, if you ask people in the West today what they think of pederasty and all of that, they'll have very strong reactions. But
Mm.
as recently as the early 90s, you can go on, like French, for example, television programs where they're interviewing prominent actors and politicians and people like that who are openly bragging about relationships that they had, sexual relationships with underage children, boys, girls, right? And it was totally normal, and no one had thought anything about it. You had the Michel Foucault, right? The
Yes.
major kind of theorist of much of the postmodern discourse. Um, uh, Also Simone de Beauvoir, the very
Yeah,
famous
we know what they were up to back in the day.
1949, and she
Yeah.
was the paramour of Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre. And you mentioned existentialism. He's one of the major 20th century existentialists. So Sartre and de Beauvoir and Foucault and these people, they all pushed to try to lower the age of consent in France in order to make it legal to have sex with what were then considered minors and are still considered minors, right? So there's a lot going on here, and people today are like, oh no, we would never, agree. Well, yeah, you wouldn't today, maybe, but like 30 years ago, it was not considered a big deal in some European countries to openly talk about adults having, sexual relationships with minors. It was perfectly fine. So
Hmm.
again, whose standard here, right? And 30 years earlier, it was this, and 30 years later now it's this, and now it's a big taboo to have underage, but now people are trying to push the limits down again. You see this. um, so who decides, right? You're always going to run into that question, whose standard? And before Muslims get I think tied into a pickle, all embarrassed about Islamic teachings on gender and sexuality and all of this, and feel like they have to, they're on the hot seat, right? We're the ones who have to answer all the difficult questions. No, it's not. Like, we have a consistent standard that's
Yes.
empirically grounded, it's morally grounded, it's grounded, we can also give very clear arguments of the hikmah behind it, the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala behind disposing of things the way he did, right? And you're the ones who are every decade, every half decade, every, whatever, 20 years, you're coming up with,
coming around. Yeah.
radically different views. And who knows where it's going to go next? Do you know when
Yep.
they allowed for gay marriage in America in 2015, the Obergefell case? Shortly thereafter, I think it was like the High Ethics Commission or something in Germany. Okay, it's a separate commission. They came together and they basically sent a proposal to the German government saying, based on secular standards and all of that, the government has no legitimate right in banning incest, basically. Okay, because incest is illegal in most countries. And they said the state has no legitimate interest in preventing consensual sexual behavior between consenting adults. And all right, so they were just, again, taking the secular consent-based sexual morality, which is nonsense, that consent is the only thing that matters, complete nonsense. They were taking this to its logical conclusion. If you have two adults who consent, no one has the right to say that what they're doing is either immoral or illegal. And so they suggested to the German government that it, abolish anti-incest laws, just like they were told before, abolish your anti-sodomy laws and abolish this and abolish that, abolish anti-incest laws. And the German government, to its credit, did not follow through on the recommendation of this ethics commission, but also the reason they gave is very shallow and very worrisome. They said the German public is not ready for this at this time. In other words, this would not be socially acceptable. It would be scandalous, and so we're not going to revoke it. But that's okay. That's a very contingent reason.
Yeah.
Where in 20 years from now, if you have enough of a push in society, enough of a lobby, enough of a hullabaloo that raised, where people start talking about how unjust it is not to embrace incest and how narrow-minded that is and whatever, and how the natural reaction against it is just a prejudice, blah blah blah, right? I don't think this will happen, but it conceivably could. And if it got to a point where the German public or any other public thought like, okay, well, we think it's fine now, then boom, okay, let's just change the law. Like, the idea is that there's no reference point where you can say, no, this is objectively wrong based on 1, 2, 3 that we can point to and agree upon. That's completely gone. And I think people really need to realize how utterly nihilistic the results of this can very easily become. Because there are people now saying, like, what is wrong with incest? What's wrong? And they'll say, well, okay, birth defects. Well, okay, you're assuming reproduction. We've already taken reproduction off the table, remember? Okay.
Yeah.
Now you've allowed homosexuality. So who said it has to be a male and a female? What about 2 brothers or 2 sisters? Why should that be wrong? And you simply cannot give a secular reason. They'll just say, oh, we just have like a revulsion or it's icky. We say, okay, well, that's what most people thought about homosexuality 30 years ago. And you've been telling people, well, if you think it's icky, then don't do it. That's not a moral judgment. That like all of this kind of flippant.
It's just based on feelings.
Exactly. It's just emotive. Alistair McIntyre talks about emotivism, right? The best that the West can now come up with in terms of ethics is basically a type of emotivism. It's like what's emotionally, but then emotions are very fickle and easily manipulated and constructed in various different ways. So there's just no basis whatsoever.
Yeah, it's absolutely worrying. It reminds me of, when Nietzsche mentions, in his Gay Science, the whole parable of the madman where God is
and
dead.
Gay just meant happy science, right?
Yeah, there's no pun there. But yeah,
the German it's a different word. It just means happy.
Happy, yeah. So that's what he meant. I assume that's what he meant at the time. But what's interesting about the parable is that the madman, he talks about killing God. These people have killed God, but he also highlights that where are they going now? Where are you going to go now? Where's up and down? Where's right and left? You don't know your bearing. You lose your bearings. He was very on point in regards to that, because when you turn away from God, you literally lose your bearings. And it reminds me of the ayah in the Quran where Allah says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. That do not be like those who forgot Allah, and therefore Allah made them forget themselves. It's a very powerful narration, a verse in the Quran, because it highlights, you turn away from that ultimate source, the objective anchor,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to know where you're going anymore. And if you put yourself in that place, in the God seat, if you like, and have this God complex,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to come up with all sorts of things that are governed by your own desires, and your
Mm-hmm.
feelings, and where you want to go, what you feel,
أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ
and that's
اتَّخَذَ
worrying.
إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen the one who's
Huh?
taken his God as his desire as his God? That's
SubhanAllah,
exactly what happens. Yeah.
SubhanAllah.
In the other
So, doctor,
verse,
I want to,
yeah.
yes, sorry, can carry on.
Let's say the other verse to me that's so important in this is, ألم تر كيف ضرب الله مثلا كلمة طيبة كشجرة طيبة أصلها ثابت وفرعها في السماء. Have you
SubhanAllah.
not seen how Allah has struck a parable of a goodly word, which is the kalimat, la ilaha illallah, as a goodly tree, right?
Mm,
أصلها ثابت, its roots are firmly planted, وفرعها في السماء, and its branches reach all the way up to the heavens. تؤتي أكلها كل حين بإذن ربها. It gives its fruit at every time by the leave of its Lord. So this is like faith, right? It's firmly the person of faith, firmly grounded in the soil, right? And the deeper the roots and the firmer the roots, the stronger the tree and the higher it can reach. It can reach all the way up to the heavens, right? Like the heavens, right? And then Allah says, and that then the likeness of a rotten tree, word, kalimatin khabitha kashajaratin khabitha, ujtuthat min fawq al-ard. This is very important, that the likeness of a bad word, which is the word of kufr, of turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of turning away from iman, of turning away from tawheed, right, to atheism, to secularism, to all of these isms that people are drowning in these days, right, is like a rotten tree. Ujtuthat min fawq al-ard. It has been uprooted from the earth, uprooted. Ma laha min qarar. This is the most, it has no fixity. Ma laha min qarar, no fixity, because it's not rooted in anything. And because it's
SubhanAllah.
not rooted, it's not fixed. It's always just going back and forth, being blown back and forth, left and right, upside down, in and out, figure eights, everything, right?
Mm,
And that to me is the modern world, right? It turned its back on God altogether, right? And so it became ujtuthat min fawq al-ard. The metaphysical anchoring was completely cut, right? So science has progressed greatly, empirical science, but metaphysically, the anchor has been cut. And so ma laha min qarar. And if there's anything permanent about the modern world, ironically, is its constant change, right? It's
mm,
constant change. The only thing you can be sure about is that everything's going to be different tomorrow than it was yesterday, right? That's the only, and it prides itself on that. That's what makes it what it proudly is. Well, yes, we change all the time. We never stay the same. We're never static, right? We're
mm,
dynamic. Okay, there's stasis and dynamic, but like these are relative terms. But when you're so dynamic that there's no fixity whatsoever, and then you're on a train and you don't even know where it's going, and it's
it's
about to
chaos.
drive off a cliff. I mean, this is a problem. We need fixity, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
this is whenever I see these phenomena, and you see these rapid changes, and uh, don't be surprised. Like that you say, "Oh my God, I would have never thought this would be the case." Well, yeah, ma laha min qarar. That always comes from ma laha min qarar. It has no fixity. So
SubhanAllah. Dr. Sharif, this is so interesting and fascinating. I mean, I've just looked at the time now,
yeah,
so we'll move on to the next section. You spent a good amount of time, and I think it'll be really beneficial for everyone that watches this. Really, sort of in a way deconstructing, this, or looking at how all of this came to be, and how from that sort of modern Western liberal secular paradigm, we these all of these sort of ideologies have emerged, in particular LGBT, which we're discussing here today. Let's look at it from an Islamic paradigm for a second. Now,
hmm
how do we understand this from an Islamic paradigm? How do we sort of correlate this, and how should we navigate this space? I guess that's two questions. We'll take the first. Let's deal with the first part first. How do we sort of understand this from an Islamic paradigm as Muslims?
okay.
What
So I
is our
think
understanding of sex, etc., all of these types of
right.
things?
So good. So even before getting into that, we have to realize, like the larger paradigm is very important here. So when you talk in the modern world, as I said before, in the 80s in the West, you could still hear the question, "What do you think about homosexuality?" And
Mm,
I remember saying that when people asked that question, it was understood that what you were asking about was the person's opinion on the morality of specific actions, right? Now, fast forward 40 years, that question doesn't exist anymore. Even the term homosexuality has kind of fallen out of use. We have LGBT now, which is a social identity category. So the only question that's left, and it's not even really a question anymore, is not what do you think of homosexuality, meaning the morality of the actions, but where do you stand on what? LGBT rights. It's become
Mm.
now a radical shift. We cannot talk about the morality of the actions anymore. That's been done away with by the sexual revolution. There's no morality beyond consent. Okay. And so the question is now only a purely socio-political one. Where do you stand on LGBT rights, i.e., the rights of a specific minority group within society? Okay. And of course, there's only one acceptable answer. Yes, I support, because are you for equality or you're for discrimination? Are you a bigot or you're a fair person? Are you like a racist or you're like someone who accepts different skin color? It's just these very kind of simplistic binaries. But the only question that can be asked now, the whole LGBT question is a socio-political question. It's been turned into a socio-political question of
Mm.
equality, rights, freedoms, discrimination, and all of this stuff, right? Which is a completely different framing, and framing which we would not accept. I mean, it's the framing which is highly problematic. Okay, so just in many Muslim youth, when they're coming from the West, that's how they're approaching this question. When they think, okay, what does Islam say about LGBT? They're primarily thinking about where am I going to stand socially speaking on the rights of this minority group, and I'm a minority, and this and that, and all the whole, we've heard all of these arguments before, right? So that paradigm, we have to put it aside completely. When we talk about this as Muslims, we're talking about, again, we don't accept this conflation of desires, actions, and identity. This is, like we split those. They're separate. We never put them together in the first place. So we don't accept that. When we look at homosexuality, we're looking at particular actions. Actions are part of, sexual actions. Sorry, homosexual actions are part of sexual actions. Sexual actions are part of human actions. Human actions are governed by a moral and ethical standard that we have in the religion that is mirrored in the Sharia, or revealed in the Sharia, and related discourses. Okay, so for us, it's a question first and foremost of, what is the basis of our morality, right? And then among all of the actions that that Allah has said something about, what is the status of various sexual behaviors? And then among that, what is, where does homosexual behavior fall into that? So that's a proper ordering. Do you see what I'm saying? So we don't just jump into this as like, oh, where do you stand on LGBT rights? That's irrelevant. The question is, we're talking about halal and haram. Is it halal to do this particular action or engage in this particular relationship? Or is it makruh? Or is it mubah? Or is it mandub? Or is it wajib? This categorizations of acts. Okay? That's what we're talking about. So for us, it's a question, a Sharia question of human actions. And again, a subset of human actions has to do with abdar, which is basically the private parts. And then what are the rules that govern that? And what's permissible and impermissible in that? And then where does now homosexual behavior fit within that? That's the proper order. And until we build that paradigm up for ourselves and our communities and our youth, there's no point in just jumping into LGBT, because you're going to be talking right past each other. Okay.
Yeah.
Even for many of our youth, like I said, all of these assumptions that even people in the West used to have about sexuality and reproduction and the natural teleology of it and heterosexuality and all of this stuff, that's not the social environment they live in anymore. So even for many of our youth, their brains are being formatted with a completely different paradigm. So when you come and say, okay, this action is haram, they have no way to process that, because they too are hearing, just like their non-Muslim counterparts, okay, you have some arbitrary moral rule. Okay, it's what Allah says. So hopefully, if they're strong in their faith, they'll say sami'na wa ata'na. We hear and we obey. But if they question why, we want to understand, here's this moral rule. We just have no idea why Allah would arbitrarily pass this rule that like undercuts people's very identity and discriminates against vulnerable minorities and all of this stuff. Like that's how they're perceiving it, right? So you have to deconstruct that paradigm and say, let's come now to Islam and let's build up a different paradigm, a different discourse with different frame of reference. So to answer your question, and again, in the course, we go into this over numerous lectures, so, we can only be very brief here, is that, we have to talk about gender before we can talk about sexuality, because they're obviously related. So Allah talks about He created everything in pairs, and He created the male and the female. So we hold
Yeah.
first and foremost that male and female are natural categories. Natural, I mean not in a naturalistic sense, but natural in the sense that Allah has created them in the universe. They're not social constructs. They're not projected by human minds, like in a subjective fashion. Okay, so male and female, these are real categories, and not just biological sex, but like a man and a woman. These are real things. Men and women are the same in many respects. And Islam is very clear about this compared to other religions that came before. Men and women are spiritually the same. They're both called to the khilafah the same. They're both called to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They both have equal chance of success in the afterlife, right? Allah says, and whoever believes and does good, min dhakarin aw untha, from a male or female, shall have their reward, so on and so forth. Inna al-muslimina wal-muslimat wal-mu'minina wal-mu'minat. We have the verse in Surah Al-Ahzab. The men who submit, the women who submit, the men who believe, the women who believe, so on and so forth, right? At the same time, when it comes to our, overall, like certain tendencies that males have versus females, and also the different functions that we play in the family, in the reproductive process, and in society and so forth, there is a differentiation. And that differentiation is also not purely socially constructed by some evil patriarchy, okay? This is also something that Allah has created in his wisdom, and it's something that is affirmed. And Allah says, Allah is not like the female, right? So I always say, like, if you look at, we talked about skin color before, right? Race or the skin color. And we say it's not that Muslims are not racist. They are, but it's unfortunate. And if a Muslim has racist attitudes, that's clearly against Islam. And there's not a single ruling of the Sharia that regards skin color. Okay, there's no rule that says white people pray here, black people pray here, other people pray here, right? Or if you have this skin color, then this rule applies to you, that skin color, completely absent. So skin color, like hair color, eye color, completely irrelevant morally, socially, legally, more religiously, okay? When it comes to gender, that's not true. There are many, many, many rulings of the Sharia that distinguish between men and women. Men have a ruling, women have a ruling, right? And this is pervasive, and we're not embarrassed by that. Okay, so we don't also fall, we cannot sign on to this second wave feminism, despite, let alone the waves that came after, which equalizes men and women in all respects, in all domains, exact same rights and duties and all of that. No, this does not accord with the reality as Allah has created it, and as He has normatively willed us also to inhabit and to live our gender. Both individually as the genders that we are, and with each other, men and women, because we do complement each other and we play complementary roles. Okay. Now, there's a lot of detail. We can't get into all of it here, but I'm just saying, if anyone's going to come to Islam with the expectation of gender equality the way it's understood today, you're not going to get very far, right? Before that's going to, there's going to be a rude awakening, right? This is not our paradigm at all. And we should not try to retrofit Islam into some type of second wave feminist, ideal. It's just, it's a waste of time. Not only is it a waste of time, it's false. It's not true. And we should be critiquing that paradigm, not trying to be apologetically trying to retrofit Islam into it. Okay. So men and women are the same in many respects. They're different in many respects. They have the same rights and duties in some cases. In other cases, men have rights that women don't have and duties that women don't have. Women have rights that men don't have and duties that men don't have. So they're not the same. And in the end of the day, they complement each other. And because this is the legislation of the Creator himself, it is just. And each person is treated justly, even if they're not treated the same. Justice means to treat like things alike and different things differently. So where men and women are treated the same in the law, it's because they are the same. And when they're treated differently, it's because they are objectively different as Allah has created them. And justice demands that they be treated according to their nature and needs, not the same as each other if they're not the same in certain respects.
Yes.
So this is not it's conceptually basic, but it's something that we have to now articulate explicitly because it's way outside of the cultural norm in the West. And it's not a discourse or a language that our young people really have access to. So we have to give them access to it so they can understand and have peace in their hearts, about Islamic norms and rulings and conceptions of gender. Okay. Now, when it comes to, so we said male and female are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're the same in some respects, different in other respects, and so on and so forth. When it comes to sexuality, right? Based on the rulings that we have, we know that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that First of all, one of the biggest sins that one can commit is zina. This is the biggest sin. So we're talking about LGBT, like, homosexual behavior, of which, again, we don't have like a single cover term for that. We have different behaviors. And, they also have different statuses in the Sharia based on the nature of the act itself. Um, we should not undermine or downplay the importance of the gravity of zina, because in the end of the day, the number of people who engage in same-sex behavior is very small compared to the number of people who engage in just male-female zina. And this is true among Muslims as well. And zina is a big problem in our communities in the West, and increasingly, I think, even in Muslim societies. And this is a huge, huge deal. Okay? So we should not direct all of our ire to, LGBT, and then we ignore a much bigger problem. I mean, statistically bigger, which is zina itself. Okay, it is one of the few had offenses. Had is one of the offenses that Allah has set penalties for, which are very stiff and severe. They're difficult to implement, but they're stiff penalties to show the abhorrence of the Sharia to certain actions. And the actions which are subject to had penalties, these major crimes and sins, are such or considered so serious because they undermine one of the basic objectives of the Sharia, which are the maqasid. And zina directly undermines the preservation of lineage, which is the preservation of the natural family, which is a central institution of society. If you break this family apart and you undermine it, you undermine the entire society. Okay, so any act which undermines the family is seen as maximally immoral, because it has maximally evil effects in the world that Allah has created, and zina is just such an act. Now, what is zina? It is male-female vaginal sexual intercourse. I mean, to be very specific. So the major sin is that. Why? Because that is the act that leads to reproduction, right? It's a very grave and consequential act. And the fact that we have birth control pills today doesn't change that, right?
Yep.
The hukum is what it is. And the fact that we can artificially, obviate the consequence does not mean that the act is now permitted, and it does not take away from the gravity of it. So that's number one. Number two is Islam is a practical religion. How does it seek to make the avoidance of zina something that is a practicable norm that the everyday, normally pious, because Muslims should be pious people, can actually abide by, rather than just a few moral superheroes in society? How? Because the sex drive is very powerful. Allah in His wisdom doesn't just say, don't commit zina. He says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا zina. Don't approach zina. Okay? Because He knows if you approach it, it's very easy to fall into it. So what does la taqrabu zina mean? He doesn't leave it for us to, wonder. We have certain restrictions which we all know or should know about when it comes to gender interaction, right? One is that we have modest dress. So we present ourselves modestly in front of the other gender. For women, of course, that's hijab. For men, it's covering at a bare minimum between the navel and the knee, but that's like only if there's need to remove the shirt. Otherwise, or from an urf perspective, even suitable male dress is much more extensive. And in most traditional societies, what men wear and what women wear is almost the same. They're wearing long flowing things that cover their whole body. The men usually cover their head with a turban or something. Maybe their neck is showing and women have the neck covered. And traditionally, the face veil also is very widespread. So women are covering a little more, right? But practically speaking, men are also covering, most of their bodies. But the idea is that we have standards about what constitutes modest dress. And Allah is explicit about this in the Quran, in Surah An-Nisa, where He tells, Surah An-Nur, where He says, believing men, lower your gaze and protect your private parts. And He says, believing women, lower your gaze and protect your private parts, and do not expose of your bodies, and so on and so forth, and then gives the list of male relatives. So modest dress, connected to that is also modest speech, modest action when we deal with the other sex, right? There should be a difference how you deal with the other sex than how you deal with your own sex, right? When you're a brother among brothers, haha, you can laugh and be, joking and light. When you're speaking with sisters, in a context where it's justified to do so, then it should be more formal. It doesn't have to be stiff, but there should be a difference, right? That's part of the internal hayat that we are supposed to cultivate as Muslims. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٍ وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاء. Every religion has a characteristic moral trait, and the characteristic moral trait of Islam is modesty, right? It's something that Muslims are supposed to be known for. It's emblematic of who we are as Muslims, right? He also says, إِذَا لَمْ تَسْتَحْيِ فَافْعَلْ أَوْ فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ. If you don't have hayat, modesty, then just do whatever you want, because hayat is what prevents you from engaging in, wrong behavior. So, number one, to make avoidance of zina a practical thing is to dress modestly, also speak modestly, comport oneself modestly with the opposite sex. Number two, no physical contact. There's not supposed to be any physical contact between non-mahrams, which means a male and a female that are not so closely related that marriage would be forbidden between them, right? There should not be any physical contact. And third, no khalwa. This is also very important. Khalwa is for a man and woman who are not mahrams of each other to be alone in a place where they do not fear unannounced intrusion. Okay, i.e., it's very reasonable why that would be the case. If you're alone in a place, anything could potentially happen, right? And if you are aware that you could be walked in on at any moment, then you're obviously not going to allow yourself to do certain things because you're basically like in public, right? So the avoidance of khalwa is something very, very, very important as well. People think, oh, does that mean Muslims think every time a man and a woman get together, they're just going to like lose all control and hit the floor? No, it doesn't mean that. But it means that very often people fall into compromised situations because they put themselves in dangerous circumstances. And you're dealing with a very, very combustible, thing here. Okay, we can say, I like to say zina is like a fire. It's like a raging fire off in the distance. And you think you're so far away from it, but the fire is here, zina, and you're over here, and you don't realize it's a dark night and you can't see the terrain. You don't realize that you're like miles away. But if you take 3 steps forward, all of a sudden, the slippery slope from where you are seemingly very far away, it can be very steep. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you take just a few steps and then you can fall very, very quickly after that, right? It's a very, very volatile thing. So Allah in his wisdom says, if you live a life where you are never alone with the opposite sex and you are not flirtatious and casual and crossing boundaries, and you present yourself modestly, and that's the way you live your life, then zina is something that is a theoretical possibility, but it's not something you would ever practically fall into, because you would have to break so many norms that you yourself would never do, because it's just not part of your nature, your character, your daily life, the way you live, your social environment, your friends. It's just not part of what you do. That if you really wanted to commit zina, you would have to be so deliberate about it and just go against so many of your own everyday habits that is just, it would never happen. But when you live in an environment like we do today in the West, where men and women, they're the same, they're everywhere together, every activity is mixed, they're constantly pairing off and just going off together and this and that, and anything can happen. And the idea is that when you say, well, okay, well, I'm strong, I know my limits. That's not the point. We're not individualistic in that sense, right? We are responsible for maintaining also a public social order and morality that is to the benefit and protection of everybody. So if you are particularly strong and know your limits and could sit alone with a woman and without falling into trouble, and you kind of know that about yourself, that doesn't matter. It's still haram for you to do that. Because the idea is, if too many people do that and you bring about a social norm in which it's socially acceptable for that to happen, now everyone's going to start doing it. And many people who are not strong enough, to really navigate that properly are going to start falling into exactly the types of issues that are supposed to be prevented by having this norm. It's just like drinking, right?
Yep.
It's just like drinking. Many people say, well, in the West too, many people drink responsibly. They have a glass of wine at dinner and this and that. And some people never get drunk, or very rarely. Right? But the point is, many, many, many people abuse it, and much fasad comes from people drinking too much. The number of accidents that happen, deaths, women abused, men abused, children abused, divorces, like all of this evil that happens. So Allah in his wisdom says, I'm not just going to say drink, but don't get drunk. It's too volatile. People have trouble following that. So in his wisdom, he says, no drinking for anybody. Okay. Now, people who theoretically, Muslims who might have been able to like drink responsibly, okay, well, sorry, in paradise you can taste the wine. You can't taste it in this life. Sami'na wa ata'na, you're happy to give it up for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's part of your devotion and worship of your Lord and your creator anyway. Okay. Theoretically, maybe you could have been the ones who could have drunk responsibly, but that's just not an option anymore. And at the same time, because the society is such that drinking is not present, it's not a norm, it's not integrated into the society like it is in the West. Most people, I think it's one of the miracles of Islam, in Muslim countries today, don't drink, even though in most countries it's available and legal, right? But most people actually don't drink because they're Muslim and it's haram and it's just not something they do and it's not part of their culture, right?
Yep.
And so a lot of this fasad is just averted by people, and their benefits in this world and the next are brought about because there is a standard set where nobody drinks, and so we just close the door to the entire thing. So when it comes to zina, it's very much the same thing. It looks very conservative from a contemporary Western perspective to say, well, we don't even mix. Mixing is another thing too, just like, mixing and, khalwa and all of this stuff. We don't do any of that. But the result
Yep.
is that avoiding zina is something that is practical and a normal thing that everybody can abide by, and not something that only, again, like I say, a moral superhero can do, because you're in a society where it's so prevalent and so easy that you really have to be exceptional, to kind of avoid it. So that's really where it comes to that. Outside of, sexual relations of a male and a female who are bound by a Islamically valid legal contract, which is basically a nikah contract for us in our day. Allah talks about those, your spouses and those who your right hands possess. We don't have right hand possessions today, slavery and so forth. So we're talking about marriage. Outside of that context, any sexual act is forbidden between anybody, whether they're a male and a female, or two males or two females. There's simply no context in Islam for legitimate sexual expression outside of a marriage, and a marriage can only be between a man and a woman.
Jazakallah khair, Doctor. That's quite thorough, mashallah. I think, but brothers and sisters that are watching or that have joined us, please go to Sapiens Institute website and go through Dr. Sharif's course. Is the most extensive course that we have on our learning platform, mashallah. And it covers all of this in a lot more detail, mashallah. Dr. Sharif's just giving us an introduction today and giving us the key points so we can, and I'm sure this is going to be immensely beneficial for everyone listening, but definitely go through that course as well. The link is in the description box below. Dr. Sharif, may Allah bless you. Jazakallah khair. You've given us so much information, but I think a good place to conclude on today is going to be, how do Muslims now, obviously going through your course is going to be a big thing so they can go through the content, but how do we, if you want to just summarize it for us, how do Muslims navigate this space? The fact that this whole LGBTQ, etc. issue is a legal issue now in many countries, it's almost presented as a moral type of issue as well in some ways. There's a lot of pressure, and some people are crumbling to the pressure. How do Muslims navigate this space? What advice would you give?
So I think first and foremost, we have to reinforce our paradigm and our norms and our values within our own communities. We can no longer take it for granted that it will be sufficient to say this is halal and this is haram. As I said, the presuppositions and the underlying assumptions have changed so radically that for many of the younger people, like, that simply won't make sense anymore, and they will reject it. Either they'll reject Islam altogether because, okay, who wants to worship a homophobic God, right? That's what I think Desmond Tutu said in South Africa, the cardinal or something, like, I don't want to worship a homophobic God, like, astaghfirullah, right? The presuppositions have changed so much that we have to we cannot take it for granted anymore that it's going to be sufficient just to say halal and haram. We have to build up, as I've tried to do here, very deliberately, what our actual view is on gender, sexuality, morality, the nature of things. All of this goes into theology, ethics, like, it's all built into our larger Islamic worldview, which is covered in the course
what
as well.
What you're saying is that we need to present, Muslims need to understand Islam as a comprehensive worldview.
Absolutely,
it's not just
yes.
a set of do's and don'ts. Allah's given
Absolutely.
us a worldview, so understand it like that, and understand that it's grounded in God. It's from the
Absolutely.
creator of the heavens and the earth. And I think that's a very powerful point that you've made, Jazakallah khair.
Absolutely.
Continue, please,
And
Doctor.
then once we do that, I mean, not temporally, like we do this at the same time, but, so that's one internally, like we need to, be much more proactive, I think, in articulating this paradigm for our youth and not shying away and not waiting till we're asked questions. Like we need to be more proactive in putting this out there and also being affirmative and being confident and showing also the shortcomings of the other paradigm. Because again, so many Muslims feel like we're in the hot seat. We're the ones who have these weird teachings that we have to explain and be apologetic about. And we have these scandalous teachings about women or about homosexuality or whatever. It's not, no, we should say, wait a minute, let me ask you a question or two, right? And you learn to go on the offensive. And then you realize how, again, we've already seen how baseless the other paradigm is and how destructive it is
Yep.
as well. So we need to equip our youth to not be arrogant, of course, but to have the confidence that, this is based in reality. And what you're doing is based in, ahwa and shahawat and all of these things. And ma laha min qarar. There's no fixity to it, right? So we have to equip them with the tools. When it comes to dealing with other people in the society, as communities, we should, as much as possible, where our rights are being infringed upon to practice our faith, we need to fight back, right? We need to fight back against societies that claim to believe in religious freedom, religious tolerance. If you're going to start saying that I cannot teach my own religion or practice my own religion, including its sexual morality, which includes certain behaviors and precludes others and all of that, and in your view discriminates, well, I'm sorry, that's what it does. And if you're going to make good on your claim to religious freedom and equality, then there has to also be a space where Muslims, Christians, Jews, others, even if the secular state is not happy with it, you cannot impose, micromanage people's religious doctrines on very sensitive issues like sexuality, marriage, reproduction, and all of these things. These are very, these are at the core of our religion. So we need
Yep.
to fight back against those, and any type of indoctrination in schools, we should also push back against. They say, like, okay, in the US, for example, you are not allowed to talk about religion in the public schools. You can't say the word God. They say it's a secular society, and people take it for granted that, okay, religion is sort of this unique thing that's like, that we have secular societies you can't talk about. Well, why is that the case? I mean, the idea is that the question of the existence of God and of which religion was true came to be a particularly contentious issue socially and politically within Western societies at a particular point in their history. And to deal with that social and political question, they came up with the idea of secularism. Just take these things off the public table because we're not going to agree on them. Okay, so there's an underlying idea that highly contentious issues that people have deep commitments, but also very divergent views on and different commitments on, in a diverse society, you kind of try to take those off the table and allow people to come together on other bases so they're not constantly like at each other's throats. It's not something specific to the question of God. Many things are of that category. And I would say something as germane to who we are as human beings as sex and sexuality and sex, sexuality, and sexual morality. Those issues are close to that. They're things that people feel very strongly about on both sides of the issue. They're very close to people's core moral commitments, their core religious commitments, right? Their core theologies, even. So if you can't talk about God in the public school because the existence of God or what precise doctrine about God's nature is the correct one, you can't talk about it because it's so divisive. I would say that's the exact same thing in a Western society when it comes to issues of sexuality, right? Teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's, whatever, but just leave this to the families, right? Don't
Yep.
indoctrinate students with one sexual morality or another. It's not the place of the school to breed tolerance of homosexual acts or behavior. We should treat all people different. We don't believe in gay bashing. We don't believe in attacking people on the streets. We don't, but you can address those issues in a more general sense. You don't have to force people to actually accept specific views on sexual behavior, specific moral views on sexual behavior, specific views on the nature of gender and all of that in order to do that, right? And so that's an ideological program that we should also resist. The last thing, when it comes to people within our community, we should distinguish between people who experience, and we didn't talk enough about this today perhaps, but it's in the course, we talk about it extensively, There are people who do have same-sex desires, who they don't choose this, right? They come of age 12, 13, 14, the hormones kick in, a young male or female, realizes that, oh my gosh, my sexual interests and so forth are not keyed to the opposite sex. They're directed towards my own sex. This is not something that people just wake up and say, oh, let me be gay today, or let me be attracted to other males or whatever. It's something they usually discover, usually to their great horror, especially if they're coming from a more traditional religious background. They don't want that often, right? They know it's haram to act on it. It's very taboo, this and that. So, this is something that the reasons for this, how these kinds of, desires, today people talk about orientation, how this arises, how it is that some people, a small, some minority, but still, like, if you just in terms of numbers, like, it's a decent, like a good number of people find themselves attracted to members of their own sex. How can they deal with this? Can they change it? If they can't, can they marry? If they can't, how do they live their lives? How can they? And there are people who deal with these types of, same-sex attractions or gender dysphoria, who, again, they're not just trying to, uh, you know, um, break down categories for the sake of it, and some postmodern type of thing. But some people do. I mean, there is like real gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria. That is a real thing. And some people do have a very deep psychological sense of mismatch between, how they feel and what their body is and so forth. So we shouldn't just sweep these things under the rug and just write them off as just part of this kind of wayward society that's falling apart and has no, religious foundations. I mean, everything we've said today is true. Like, those are aspects of it. But when you sweep all of that away, there still are people who are, experience same-sex attractions, experience gender dysphoria. They don't choose it. It's not something they can just turn on and off as a switch, right? People who are like that within the Muslim community, and they do exist, and they exist in greater numbers than most people probably imagine. And they're not just dissolute people who aren't religious. Some of them are very religious, and they're in the masajid, and they're in our organizations, and they're running the activities, and they love Allah and His Messenger, and they're spreading the deen, and they're calling dawah to it, but they deal with this. And maybe no one knows about it, but it's a reality. And so when people like this come to us, right, we need to know that those people, if they are especially, adhering to Islamic norms and moral commitments, right, and not trying to rewrite the deen and reform it, deform it, and transform it, and so forth. Those people are brothers and sisters like anybody else. All of us have challenges. All of us have things we're dealing with. All of us would be very embarrassed if our private, hearts and activities were made public to other people.
Yep.
Okay. So we also don't, because we don't have a category of sexual identity, we should not, put people like this in a specific category that deserves specific, like, distancing or ostracization or something like that. I'm talking about people who are faithful to the deen and who are sincerely struggling with these issues. Even if they fall, even if they sin, it's the same as if someone else sins. Okay, you fall, we pick you back up, you make repentance, let's keep walking forward together, right? We have to have the maturity to understand that these are very real issues. They're very deep. They're not easily solvable, right? And so people who are dealing with them, they're dealing with something that's quite weighty, and something that really, they need support. And we have great resources in our community for this now, especially a podcast called A Way Beyond the Rainbow, 88 episodes, which deals with every conceivable aspect of this issue. Homosexual, same-sex attractions primarily, but also gender identity issues and gender dysphoria, primarily from the perspective of those struggling with it, faithfully struggling with it. But also there are, episodes that address the community, parents, imams, chaplains, friends, so on and so forth. It's really unique among religious community. I haven't seen this in any other religious community. 88 episodes, podcast.
Wow.
It's very well done. So it's called A Way Beyond the Rainbow. It's by a Muslim, and it's all, Islamically orthodox and integrated into our tradition and also current discussions. So that's number one. Those are for people who I call faithful strugglers. Number two, people who are, whether they deal with these issues personally or not, who have jumped on the kind of liberal bandwagon, and who are all about, well, we believe in equality and this and that, and we don't, we're going to come and reform the deen. This is completely unacceptable. There's no room, there's no space in our community. This is not an issue of ikhtilaf. There's absolute consensus among our scholars about the status of these acts. It's very, very clear in the Quran as well in the Sunnah. This is not something that is that we're having discussions about. Well, we're going to start having gay nikah and all of this, right? So people are pushing for that or trying to guilt trip the Muslim community into there's no place in Islam for certain people and all of that. You say no, there's a place in Islam for everybody, right? But Islam means submission also. And when people
Mm.
come to Islam, at least in principle, we are trying to submit. Okay, we all
Yeah.
fail in that. But when you start saying, "Well, I'm not going to submit. I'm going to start changing what it means to submit," this is where we draw the line. And it's not just on this issue; it's on any issue. If you want to come and start saying, "Well, alcohol is so prevalent, let's start drinking," right?
Yeah.
Does it really mean khamr means khamr? Does it really mean everything else? Wasn't there a discussion in the early community about nabith, blah, 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 whatever, okay? And you want to start bringing, I'm sorry, if you drink on your own time and you're addicted and you're trying to, okay, come to prayer. We want you to come to the halaqah, but you're not going to bring it into the masjid, right? You're not going to
Yeah.
set up a wine table at the next Eid function. This is unacceptable because you're
Mm.
undermining the very norm, okay? If you are dealing with any type of desire, even if you're engaging in behavior that is unbecoming, right? No one's going to kick you out of a mosque. We don't stand by the door and say, "What have you sinned in the last 24 hours?" Or "Where were you last night?" Or "What was your sin?" We don't have any mechanism for doing that. Everyone's welcome to come in, but you're not going to start coming in and wearing your sin on your sleeve and normalizing it and trying to change the norms of the deen such that, okay, this is now something we need to celebrate, to be inclusive, to be egalitarian, whatever buzzwords are used for this purpose. This is not something that we can accept as a community. So that's a fine line. It's not a fine line, actually. It's very clear.
Yeah.
uh, it's a matter of like, look, let me put it this way. You could be someone who drinks a glass of wine every day, and you're a Muslim and you pray and you fast and you know that alcohol is forbidden and you know that you're sinful in doing so, okay? You're a Muslim. You're sinful and you shouldn't be drinking every day, but you're a Muslim. If you come and say, maybe you've never had a sip, a drop of wine in your entire life, and you don't drink, but you say it's permissible in Islam to drink wine, you've left Islam. You're not
Mm.
Muslim anymore. Okay. So the
Yeah.
person who's drinking every day is my brother. He stands by me in prayer. He dies. We bury him in a Muslim summit. That's a Muslim. Okay. Someone who has never drunk a single drink, but comes and says Islam does not forbid wine, khamar. Okay. And what's understood by that person has left Islam by saying that. So similarly, I don't care whether you have same-sex desires, you don't, whatever. If you're advocating for the normalization of same-sex behaviors, right, and things like this, or gender transitioning, which is also not permissible, and you're saying this is normal and it's okay in Islam, you're very seriously putting your Islam in danger, if not leaving it altogether. I don't want to make, be careful here, right?
Yeah.
But the idea is that whether you're doing it or not, you are normatively changing the religion, which is something that is extremely serious. But you could be someone who deals with these struggles. Maybe you fail. Maybe you fall into same-sex behavior. Maybe you do this and that, but you repent and you're sorrowful and you have nedam, regret, and you make tawbah and all of this. You are a Muslim like every other Muslim who's doing a different sin or something else or trying to improve themselves in a different way. And you stand next to me in prayer and you stand next to whoever, and you're part of this community. But as soon as you stand up and say, no, we're changing it and we're making these things permissible and we're pushing this thing, I don't care if you're straight as an arrow, you've never had a homosexual thought in your mind, doesn't matter, right? You've now made yourself an enemy of this religion because you are trying to subvert it from within. And so that's very important. It's not about, gay and straight and having same-sex desires. That's not even what it's about. It's about your normative commitment to the deen and undermining normative Islam. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope
Mashallah.
that's clear. Yeah.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, doctor. I think you've given everyone a lot of food for thought. I don't want anyone to feel like there's no need to go through the course now. As extensive as this was, mashallah, the course is extremely extensive. I'm actually going to go through it myself as well. I haven't had the chance to go through it yet, but mashallah, like I said, it's the most extensive course and it's well referenced. I mean, as far as I've heard, there's so much. I mean, it's thorough. All the referencing is there, so you guys can go through the course and there's further reading material, etc. So the course is there. Please go and check that out, brothers and sisters. Dr. Sharif, is there any other resources you want to quickly mention, inshallah, before we wrap up? You've mentioned the podcast and everything already, but
Yeah, I think
any
the
other?
yeah, A Wave Beyond the Rainbow, that's certainly the most significant one, especially for people who are struggling with this, right? For Muslims, Muslim brothers and sisters. Again, I repeat, these are our brothers and sisters. They're the same as every other Muslim who are faithfully struggling with these kinds of issues. You should check out A Way Beyond the Rainbow. If you're also dealing with youth, or with, you're an imam, or you're a counselor or a parent, or you run a school, also I would check out, if not the entire podcast, go through the episodes and look at the ones that are directed towards, your specific category, because there are episodes for everybody. I would also say the writings of Brother Mubin Vaid, Vaid, are superb on this issue, not just LGBT, but all kind of gender and sexuality issues. I think he does an exceptional job of articulating Islamic positions and answering very effectively some modern contentions, and is extremely well read and familiar with contemporary literature as well. There are other lectures online and some other written materials. I don't have them on the top of my head, but actually in the course there is an entire lecture there are 44 lectures. One of them is all about resources, and so there's a whole lecture where we go through the resources, and there are slides that show them, and I kind of annotate them while speaking. And then also the course comes with a very extensive slide deck of over 600 slides. And
Mashallah.
also in, I think it's lecture 43 references, there's like a set of slides that are coordinated with that lecture. And those slides also contain, all of the other, lectures, and also some written materials and articles and so forth. So I think it's, rather than me just rattling them off and people trying to rush to scribble them down, you can just go to the course and listen to the lecture, and or just go to the slide deck to the relevant slides, and you'll see everything written down with links too. You can just click and it'll take you straight to the resource itself. All of the
Mashallah.
URLs are embedded in the slides as well. And as everyone knows, Sapiens courses, mashallah, may Allah bless the Institute and those behind it, are all completely free of charge. So, you have access to all of this material, and all of Sapiens's material with, literally zero cost. At zero cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Sharif. May Allah bless you. Thank you for coming on and doing this today. I'm sure everyone's benefit, brothers and sisters. Link is in the description. Definitely go and check that course out. Dr. Sharif's course on the LGBT topic. So everything you've heard today, in a far more extensive form, inshallah, so you guys can learn this information, and it's very relevant, as we know. Jazakallah khair, Dr. May Allah bless you. Thank you for coming on, and inshallah we'll catch up very soon.
Barakallahu fikum, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.